meeting is being recorded.
No, jolly good. Well, good evening. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Leah. And thanks everybody for listening to me. I hope it's not going to be too much of a problem because I can be very boring. Oh my God, it's even worse. I can see myself big now. So that's something of an issue. As Simon says, to understand my interpretation of disability studies, it's important to understand where I come from, basically, because it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't have been for lots of things that occurred in my life anyway. So basically what will happen is I shall say something to start with, what I think disability studies should be focusing on. In other words, what is a disability? Then I'll say how I got involved in disability studies and what I did at Leeds and why, and how I hope that disability studies will evolve, because at the moment it seems to me that disability studies to a large extent has lost its way, but that's an issue that hopefully we'll discuss later. So firstly, I want to stress the fact that for me, disability is not a minority issue. One of the important things about disability studies, as I understand it, is the focus is not necessarily on impairment-related issues, it's on the way society responds to people with some kind of perceived impairment. Now, what I mean by that is the majority of disabled people are not born with impairments, basically, whether they be of the body or mind. The majority of disabled people or people with impairments acquire them through the life course. It's only a minority of people who are born with conditions such as my own, which is congenital cataract, which rendered me as blind when I was born. The majority of people acquire impairments through the life course, through either ill health, accident, violence, war, and old age. The reality is that we all live long enough, we will become disabled. We now have a disabled queen, although she would never admit it. But at the moment, she can't attend virtual things. She's 96 years old and she has various impairments. So impairment is a fact of life. The reality it's seen as a minority issue, which is often the case, is nonsense to begin with. The World Health Organization's report of 2011 identified poverty as the major cause of impairment across the world. And it's when you think about the way in which medicine in most countries is about finance and whether you can pay for it, whether people have enough to eat and so on and so forth, you can understand why poverty is one of the biggest factors in determining whether somebody acquires an impairment at some stage in their life. So that's what I want to stress right at the beginning. This is not a minority issue. It's it's an issue for everyone, and it's an issue for all academic disciplines as far as I'm concerned. So, okay, so we've got what disability is, essentially. If we look at how I got involved in disability, then you have to look at my biography. Essentially, as I've already mentioned, I was born blind. After about 7 months, I had operations which rendered me with 1/6 of what a normal person can see, whatever a normal person is. In one sense, I was very fortunate in the fact that I was born within a family where impairment was not a major issue, because my father, who was born with the same condition and after the same operations, could see similar to me, basically. So he understood the problems of disablement, basically. He also, at 6 or 7 months, emigrated with his family to Montreal, Canada. And he grew up in Montreal, in French-speaking Montreal, which is interesting because the family was English, of course. And he never, while he was in Montreal, was segregated from a mainstream class. According to what he told me, the only time he was removed from the class was so that he could read on his own with a teacher, basically, because he had to hold his books close to his face and so on and so forth. And he lived in Montreal till he was 18 years old. Now, he came to England following in his mother, because my grandfather apparently was a bit of a lad, basically, to put it nicely, and used to knock my grandmother around a bit. He also had, shall we say, he was involved in my brother, who did a life case history of him, suggests that he was involved in bootlegging spirits down into America and so on. But my grandmother left my grandfather when she was 18. And because my grandfather didn't take out Canadian citizenship, my father followed my grandmother, basically, couldn't go back to Canada, which he wanted to do. He tried to get work in Leeds, where my grandmother moved to, but couldn't get work anywhere because it was all engineering and tailoring and so on and so forth. And nobody with poor eyesight would end up in those kind of industries. So he worked his entire life in a sheltered workshop for blind people, and hated it, to be honest, for reasons which you can ask me later. But my mother also acquired nervous breakdowns when I was about 7 years old, and was later diagnosed with mental illness and schizophrenia. But it's not surprising when you consider that my father worked in a sheltered workshop on what we would call minimum wage today. And I was sent off to a residential school for blind and deaf kids at 4.5. And I was there until I was 7 years old. Then I went to a special class on a mainstream school for partially sighted kids, and left there at 11.5, nearly 12 years old. I was educated in what was then called a secondary modern school, left at 15, and went into the catering industry. So my whole background, if you like, has been dealing with society's response to people with impairments. Now, I was at school, they thought that somebody like me could work in something like what's today called the hospitality industry. And I was lucky enough to get into a college for what was technical college in those days, to do a national diploma in the hotel and catering industry. And rather than end up where my father worked, I thought that was a great opportunity, basically. So I was at college for 2 years, got a national diploma in hotel and catering industry, and worked in industrial canteens until I was in my late 20s. I didn't particularly want to stay in catering, basically. So I wanted to get out of catering. So I did some O-levels at night school while I was working. Started off with sociology, economics, and English. I had some catering certificates, and in 1980, I was offered redundancy, basically, which I took, and joined a local group of disabled kids, basically, because one of the things that was happening where my father worked, some of the kids where I was at school with ended up in my dad's workshop. Now I didn't. Now I hold my parents for that because they understood the problems that I faced and taught me how to pass, how to stick up for myself at school and all that sort of stuff. So it never bothered me in the least, although it was obviously a problem in some cases, but you overcome that if you can, and I could at the time. So I decided that instead of staying in catering and moving on, I wanted to teach disabled kids how to not to be disabled. So I joined a local group of young disabled people aged 15 to 30 who, because there was no work in Leeds for these young kids, there were various impairments, lots of different impairments, they were just not able to get in schools. And what happened was these kids were shuttled from one day centre to another, day centres for older people. So over a course of a week, they went to 5 different day centres full of old people. But that's an interesting experience, which I'll get to later in a minute. But the point was, I wanted to do work with those kids and stop them ending up in school. So I thought, right, I'll get a teaching certificate. So I applied to a college in Bradford, which specialised in teaching teachers for further and higher education. Now, because I didn't have a particular interest in catering, I applied and said I wanted to teach disabled kids how not to be disabled. Now, they didn't have any opportunities for teaching disabled children and disabled young people at that college. So I had to do 2 interviews and 2 sets of exams, basically. One for just teaching practice and one for teaching theory. The teaching practice had to be catering. So I had to teach 2 sorts of groups twice. I got a distinction from there. After that, because there was one group of parents of disabled kids at that school, and we turned that particular group into a group understanding the way those kids were discriminated against. And there was a lecturer there called Brian, I think it was Brian Hyland, not the singer, who said to me, look, if you feel so strongly about this, then you should do something else. Why don't you go to university? So I enrolled or applied to Leeds University and went in 1982. And I went to the office in the university and saw a chap. Well, the interesting thing was my appointment was 11 o'clock and I was waiting 20 minutes for this chap to arrive called Robert Towler. He was a nice bloke, but he asked me why I wanted to do sociology and social policy. And I just said to him, I want to do disability. And he said, what do you mean? I said, I want to do disability discrimination. And he said, you're in, just like that. I had to take 2 exams before I could go in. And I started in Leeds doing sociology, and I did okay. I ended up with a 2-1, but specialised in disablement. I produced a 17,000-word dissertation called the Sociology of Disability, Discrimination and Disabled People. That dissertation is now available on the Disability Archive at Leeds, which you can download. It was submitted in 1985. And because I was so keen to do something about disablement, I thought I'll go on and do an MA or a PhD. I skipped the MA because I'd worked with disabled young people. I wanted to show how those disabled young people were treated and what the difficulties were that they faced, basically. So I studied hard, came across various writers who were writing in the field of disability. But the material that I had to find was not on the general sociology, social policy agenda. There were some items that were written by various people that were available in the university, which I found really useful. One of a significant book was Paul Hunt's Stigma, which was produced in 1966. Now, Paul Hunt was a disabled young man who led a rebellion in a Leonard Cheshire home, and he produced a book which was about the experience of disablement called Stigma. This is before Goffman became available in Britain, incidentally. Goffman's Stigma wasn't published till 1968 in England. But Paul produced this book. It had 6 articles by men and 6 chapters by women, all focusing on the experience of disablement. And that was a particularly interesting book. I also came across Vic Finkelstein's Attitudes on Disabled People, which is a book which was written, it wasn't in the library or anything, it was given to me by a chap called Colin Lowe, who knew Vic. was working at the university. He wasn't interested in disability studies particularly. He was working in some other department. I can't remember what it is now, but he's in the House of Lords, is Colin. He was blind, and he gave me Vic's Attitudes and Disabled People, which was brilliant because it focused on the relationship between disability and capitalism, which I'd already touched on in my dissertation, but you can read that if you wish anyway. We'll get to it later. The point was that most of the material that I focused on in my PhD was not freely available in sociology and social policy literature, which was interesting, which we'll get to in a second. So basically what I did was I did an empirical study of the experiences of these young people and wrote a dissertation which was submitted in 1988. And I immediately sent it off for publication, and it was published as Cabbage Syndrome, The Social Construction of Dependence, which is the book of research based on the work that I'd done with those young people. At the same time, while I was doing my PhD, I was teaching in Leeds, teaching sociology, as many PhD students do, teaching sociology and social policy are there. Because one of the things that's interesting about universities, most people in those days, which we're talking about the late 80s, didn't really teach. They lectured. And if you've ever done a course on teaching, lecturing is the worst kind of information. Don't know what that is. Don't worry about that. Don't know what it is. So that was my PhD, basically. It was published in 1990. I mean, I'd sent it off, and before I was actually examined for my PhD, I'd got a contract for producing that book. And actually, I did the design for the cover, interestingly. So I'd been teaching in Leeds, but in 1989, I came across an advert for a researcher to work for the British Council of Organisations of Disabled People. Now that was a mind opener for me, because up in Leeds, there were no real disability organisations that were operating as user-led organisations, disabled people's organisations, disabled people's groups. There were groups of disabled people that they were linked to the council. They weren't political at all in any way whatsoever. And as I'd already established in my dissertation for my undergraduate degree, disability is a political issue. It's a political issue in Cabbage Syndrome. Now, I went to an interview to get the research, to do the research. The interview was, the job was to produce evidence of discrimination against disabled people. And the interview was at the Spinal Injuries Association in London. And I was interviewed by Mike Oliver, Jane Campbell, and Stephen Bradshaw. And the interesting thing was that when I got there, I was ushered into a room faced by 3 wheelchair users, and there was no chair, which I often rub Jane about because it's very interesting that it was all assumed that I was going to be a wheelchair user and so on. So because I'd worked at Leeds teaching and was still teaching while I was doing the research, you were only allowed to do 6 hours teaching, but I needed the money because BCODP didn't have a great deal of money. So I was not on a particularly high wage, and I'd got a family to support. I persuaded the university to let me use the office that I was teaching in, which I shared with another chap, as the British Council of Organisations of Disabled People's Research Unit. That was set up in 1990. Now, while I was teaching, I was introducing disability issues into the courses that I was teaching on. When you're talking about inequality, disability has to be part of that argument. So consequently, everybody was aware of what I was doing. And after I'd completed my research for BCODP in 1991-92 and published Disabled People in Britain and Discrimination, a case for anti-discrimination legislation. I was offered a one-year contract at Leeds doing short courses, not a lecturer's job, a one-year contract. But I put together a course on disability studies, an introduction to disability studies. And that course I had to, because I was a part-time, a one-year contract, I had to put it under somebody else's name because I wasn't fully employed by the university on a long-term basis. So that's how Jeff Mercer, who was my supervisor for my PhD, came involved in disability studies, because Jeff had done nothing before in disability before he met me. So that course ran in the second half of my first year. And because of that, and the fact that I got 2 publications, 2 books out, several articles in various journals, and another contract to do a piece on media studies, they gave me a 3-year contract. So the 3-year contract continued, and I did more research, did various things, and was promoting disability discrimination, the argument for disability discrimination legislation all over the country. Now, the interesting thing was that the course that I produced at Leeds was disability studies, as I understand it. The basis of the course was Mike Oliver's Politics of Disablement and Disabled People in Britain Discrimination. The whole ethos of the course was theory, policy, practice. It wasn't simply theory and it wasn't simply policy, because I'd already been teaching disability equality training on my short courses year. So it was all built into the course. And because of that success at undergraduate level, we opened a postgraduate level in 1993. Originally, I opened a diploma in disability studies, which didn't require people to have any pre-qualifications, simply because I understand from experience that lots of disabled people don't get a chance to get A-levels, O-levels, and so on and so forth. And it attracted various people who all had to do an essay before they could join the course. But the course was a success. The one-year course was a success. And the students wanted more than just a diploma. So the university allowed me to turn it into an MA, and it became a 2-year course. And it was hugely successful. And that proceeded ongoing until 1998, when we turned it into a distance learning course, and it became more successful. Now, the interesting thing was that we were attracting students who wanted to go further than do an MA and wanted to do things like PhDs and so on. And my first students were Mark Priestley, Alison Sheldon, Emma Stone, Majid Tumasani, all who wanted to do disability as a PhD, and all were successful in the end. So that's how the whole thing started. But besides teaching, we were doing research and doing conferences, because when we were at Leeds initially, we could, if you generated income, you could use it to fund projects. So we funded conferences. And one of the first conferences we put together was in 1985, which brought together medical sociologists and disability activists. And it was about the relationship between medical sociology and disability studies. Because if you've done anything in disability, you will know that World Health Organization's WHO scheme was set up by sociologists, the impairment, disability, handicap, and the response was that impairment was the main cause of disability. Now, the interesting thing was that we turned it on its head. Disability was the problem of society. Society was the problem for rejecting people with particular conditions who were viewed as impairments, failures in some way or another, basically. But we'll talk about more of this later. Anyway, we had a conference, we had conflicts between medical sociologists and disability studies activists. And I put together a set of articles from those conferences and tried to get them published for various other publishers. Couldn't get them done anywhere. Nobody was interested in disability studies or the issues being raised. So consequently, we set up the Disability Press. This is the first disability press book. It's exploring the divide, illness and disability. And it's got some excellent work in it by Mike Oliver, various others, all focusing on issues that the conflict between medical sociology and disability studies. Because unlike disability studies in America during the 1970s and 80s, and continuing afterwards, medical sociology and disability studies were very, very, very closely linked. To keep away from the idea that we were focusing on illness and disability and health and ill health, we focused completely from a social model perspective. Everything that we did was through a social model lens. Now, that's not just saying, well, you stuffed a social model down people's throats straight away. You just make it clear that the emphasis is on responses to impairment, not the impairment. Now, that's not to say that you don't need to know about impairments, because for obviously, you know, I couldn't be a train driver, a bus driver, or a plane driver because I can't see very well. So people take that on board. But that's not saying that's the problem, if you see what I mean. It's an issue. Everybody has issues, but the issue is that everything goes with the discrimination because you've got visual impairment or whatever. Anyway, that continued throughout the 1990s. And 1998, 99. Oh, by the way, these books initially, there were four first ones before 1999. That was one, which is Disability Studies, Past, Present and Future. This is another one by Emma Stone, Disability and Development. These are all from conferences that were funded through the 1990s at Leeds. There's another one called Researching Disability, which was from a social model perspective, but I don't seem to have that. The important thing was these books were all made available in fully accessible formats. We're producing A3 size books in large print. People could get tapes and you could even get Braille copies, because at that time the University of Leeds had the Brailling unit for the National Institute for the Blind and the ground floor attached to the Human Resources Department. So they did Braille copies for people who needed them. From 2000, of course, all the books that we produced, and over the years, we've produced 16 books altogether and research reports. All of them after 2000 were available via disc. So you could get a disc with everything on that you could stick into your computer and it would be audio or whatever. It's interesting to note that in 1999, I set up the Disability Archive UK to make everything that we have produced at Leeds freely available to anybody who wants it. Now, that archive is still there. I think the last publication that's in it is 2016, which was something written by Simon and me. So if you want to go and have a look at the Disability Archive. But all these books are freely available to download, as is Mike Oliver's Politics of Disablement, as is Nick Finkelstein's Attitudes and Disabled People, as is all the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation books, publications, and even Paul Hunt's Stigma, the Experience of Disability, which I mentioned earlier. Because when you look at disability studies and disability politics, it is not new. The interesting thing here is that disability politics has been around since at least the 19th century. The National League of Blind and Disabled were campaigning for justice, not charity, in the 1920s. Disability organizations led by disabled people started to emerge in the 1920s and in the 1940s. The other important point is, of course, in Britain, the Union of the Physically Impaired, which was formed by Paul Hunt in 1974, which built on the Disability Alliance and Disability Income Group, which were formed in the 1960s. UPIS was all disabled people, and it redefined disability, as I mentioned earlier. Impairment is about the body. Now, everybody says it's all about physical impairment, but basically, UPIS in 1978 made it quite clear that impairment is not something that's peculiar to one section of the body. If you have an impairment that's physical, you have to deal with issues that can cause psychological issues and vice versa. So basically, you have to view impairment as a holistic issue if you follow that perspective. But the focus for UPIS and disability studies, as far as I'm concerned, is about social responses to people with impairments. Now, debates about impairment, I'm sure we'll get into later, but that's where we are from. So it's not about the impairment and its consequences for whatever. It's about society and society's response to particular issues. Okay, that's what disability is. Okay. Now, all of that was very successful as it became particularly important. I was involved in York University in Toronto. I was involved in universities in Sweden. Over the years, I've visited many countries, spoken on disability. And when I left Leeds, because I think I'm just about up to the end, yeah, it should be just nearly finished now, it's nearly 7:45. When we left disability, when I retired in 2014, we had a fully postgraduate disability program, undergraduate courses and postgraduate courses, and a distance learning option. We had links to disabled people's organisations. The archive was still running. The archive is still running still. And that's how it's left. Now, since then, I don't want to go too far into Leeds. I'm sure it's not gone the way it was I didn't expected it to be. I'm not involved at all really in Leeds at the moment for reasons which I don't want to go into. But disability studies has become blurred in lots of ways. When you think about some of the writings that are coming out, there's this issue about ableism. Now, ableism for me is about society's assumptions that everybody's able-bodied. Now, that's central to disability studies, if you like. And there's a question of rewriting history and forgetting what's gone before, if you know what I mean. And I think that's a great shame. A lot of the organisations that were in particular involved in disability studies seem to have disappeared in some way, certainly in the UK. There's only probably the Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People and Spectrum down in Southampton that are particularly active in the UK as far as disability politics. The BCODP closed down in 2006, and the legislation policies that were introduced with the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit in 2005 have not been fully implemented at all. And indeed, the Disability Discrimination Act, which we got in 1995, has been abolished effectively. We've got equality laws, yes, but anybody who's worked in industry, and I have, and we at the university, it's the same. If you have issues around disability, they're all treated at the last thing, basically. Because to address disability discrimination, it's not just about participation, it's not just about people, it's about the environment, and it's about changing policies practice. And if you go back to 2005, there was a Disability Equality Act that was introduced, theoretically. And the idea was that every 3 years, every institution and industry should readdress its policies regarding disability. So they would set what they could achieve within 3 years. And after that 3 years, they would build on another 3 years and so on and so forth. And the argument was, theoretically, that by something like by now, 22, most of the serious issues, structural issues, would begin to seriously disappear. But as you probably gather, none of that's taken place. Disability policy now is limited, to say the least, and it's reflected in a lot of universities. It's not seen as overtly political or even radical. So there you have it. And I'm not sure where it's going to go at the moment. I'm an optimist in the end, although it's very difficult to be an optimist in this particular climate that we're in now. But when you look at history anyway, there's always been issues about war and so on and so forth. That's not saying it's any worse than it is now. I think the major catalyst that we've got to be aware of now is the climate change, but that's something we never had to address before. But there again, if you look at some of the writings and the material that was produced in the 1960s and 70s, many writers were talking about, I mean, I can think immediately of a song by Neil Young where one of the lines is, "Look at Mother Nature on the run" in the 1970s. So, you know, we've been aware of all these things for many years. Society seems to close its eyes, pardon the pun, to certain issues that it can't deal with, which is not particularly good for anybody. But hopefully things will change. And I think that's about it. I've been at it for too long. I've left so much out I can't think about. You'll have to just ask me questions. Okay? Thanks for listening. If you want to close down now, that's okay with me. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Colin. Thank you. So we have had some questions come through from the audience, but what we're going to do first is have a quick 5-minute break. When we come back, it'll be questions from panelists, so more for discussion between you and the panelists that we've got. And then I'll feed those questions from the audience back to you now. So you can go and have 5 minutes and then you've got a whole load of questions coming your way.
Okay.
Thanks,
everyone. Gin and tonic, yes.
Yeah, gin and tonic.
I'll just get a nice glass of water.
See you all in 5.
This meeting is being recorded.
Perfect. So who wants to kick us off from the panelists?
I'm happy to jump in. So I've been chatting throughout the break. Colin, one thing that I find really interesting and I often find a little bit challenging, and I sometimes think maybe I find it a little bit challenging because I'm kind of that bridge between, you know, disability studies from the late 80s, early 90s when it first emerges, and it's really about, it's not just about a disciplinary field, but it's actually about a political struggle for recognition. So, you know, it's a very intense historical time. And then, you know, we have this more, I guess, what I would call the new disability studies, which really is about lived expertise, you know, this focus on ableism and then how, you know, we need to go beyond kind of environmental structures and social attitudes, but look at the ways that ableism is structured. And I find that this is because I work in the Indigenous space, the queer space, you know, my work is really increasingly multidisciplinary. And part of the reason why I'm engaged in multidisciplinary research is largely through invitation, because people want to understand the disability experience. And I'm very conscious that, you know, we do have this disciplinary divide, and it appears as an intergenerational divide between those who have struggled to establish the fields and those who are really kind of, I guess, a generation kind of who are benefiting from that struggle and the establishment of these disciplinary fields, and are able to maybe engage with it more around lived expertise, processes of embodied experience. And I'm just wondering how we can bridge and support emerging scholars around that this new, disciplinary experience as they're understanding it. And, so we don't create schisms, but enable a flourishing and a growth within the field of disciplinary studies that's productive, that creates rigorous dialogue and debate, but also encourages, new developments within the field. And I think, personally, I feel, as someone who works across, areas of what I would say marginality, seems to be a general trend. We have this in queer theory, within feminist theory, and I think we have this in disability theory as well. And so I'm wondering how you saw that as someone who is from it is lived expertise, as you've clearly described in your own personal journey, and how that really comes into disability studies as you understand it. But how we bridge this intergenerational divide so that we really enable and encourage those coming up behind us to not just understand the history of struggle, but to build on that struggle without denying them their own lived expertise, given the gains, because they are working from a different historical material reality. So, I just want to put that out there, I guess, as maybe a contentious but an opening question. So we're bridging intergenerational solidarities in our work and our support for the future. Over to you.
I don't have a problem with anything you said at all, but it depends what you want to do. If you want a separate discipline on feminism, racism, ableism, whatever, that's fine, as long as it doesn't exclude issues around disablement. My position, as I said right at the very beginning, is that disability studies should be multidisciplinary. Alison and I talked really seriously about this when I was last time in the university and we're talking about stuff like this. I would like to see disability studies as a separate issue, only in the sense that it leads into other issues, such as, I think disability studies should be integral to every department in a university and every theory. Now, the problem with theories generally is that people who go down one particular road exclude others. It doesn't concern them. Now, the point I said at the very beginning, impairment concerns everyone. So if you want to go down the road of feminism, gay theory, I'm not sure about ableism, because I think that's just a diversion that's unnecessary, but that's another issue. I'm not going to argue with anybody about that. But I just think that the problem is that when people pick up on particular issues, like if you look at the way in which politics changed over the 2000s, initially, up until about 2005, disability politics and disability studies was about focusing on issues that discriminate against disabled people, theories and practicalities that were a barrier to people's inclusion, if you like. And over the next 5 years, other issues came into power. And what happened to disability studies? Disability issues, they disappeared behind feminism, behind sexist arguments, behind other arguments. And that's not what it should be, because as I said right at the very beginning, impairment affects everybody in society, regardless of their particular issue. And to separate all that out into one particular issue becomes a problem, because people say, well, you know, I'm a theorist and you don't know about this theory and you don't know about that theory, and it all gets in the way of practice. We, as Simon and I, worked with the Department of Engineering at Leeds on issues around article structures, architecture, stuff like that. That's the kind of issues that should address disability studies. If you want to talk about radicalism, then fine, yeah, that's fine. Talk about politics and how it includes every particular group in society. I mean, if you look at disability from the broadest perspective, as I used to tell students when they were talking about what was and what wasn't impairment, I used to say, well, if you go back to the 19th century, let's not forget that women were inferior men and black people were inferior humans, if you see what I mean. If you look at issues now, we have all kinds of issues that are coming up as impairments, which weren't particularly a problem when I was younger, if you see what I mean. So multidisciplinary studies, fine, as long as it doesn't overshadow the key issues that we're trying to get across in what I talk about as disability studies, and that is the issues surrounding people's perceived impairments. Does that answer your question?
It does. It kind of, you know, sometimes, particularly working in the Indigenous disability space, I mean, what you're suggesting, sometimes I argue actually, you know, there has been this massive global shift to the notion of intersectionality. But sometimes actually, I think we need to come back to what I would suggest is more kind of post-colonial scholarship around the work of Spivak, who actually talks, you know, about this whole idea of strategic essentialism, where we actually need to prioritize what I would suggest is thinking about emplacement. So where we're emplacing an identity, a disability identity first, particularly under neoliberalism, where we have a struggle for the material.
A disability identity for me is a political animal.
So, yeah, so I mean, to me, there's always these tensions around, I guess,
when I first started in this field, for example, people used to say, I'm a person with disability. And I used to say, well, so it's your problem. I'm a disabled person because society disables against me because I'm visually impaired. There's a fundamental difference between a person with a disability and a disabled person. And it's fundamental. Now, if you want to identify in a particular way, that's entirely up to anybody. But basically, if you ignore the fact that you are losing out because of society's response to whatever your identity is, then you're swallowing up the responsibility of the problem. Do you follow what I mean?
Yeah. Okay, there's lots of questions. I think I'll hand over to someone, another panel member.
Can I follow through? Sorry, Simon, I'm jumping in before you. Theresa from South Africa. Colin, thank you very much. It's National Women's Day in South Africa, so I'm allowing myself to take the liberty of speaking first. I just want to appreciate that it was Leeds University Centre for Disability Studies and discussions with Colin and Jeff, Mark, Alexis and Caroline that actually helped us develop a very engaged and robust disability studies at University of Cape Town. That's grown because it was really influenced by Colin not wanting to have us started unless disabled people South Africa were involved. And I think that was critical. But Colin, we are 21 years down the line, and the struggle to get other disciplines in other departments and faculties to recognize the relevance of disability studies to their disciplines is very hard.
It is.
And I want to know, like, do you not have any gems of how we can do that? Because the arguments, even with intersectionality coming up, Karen, is that there's not space in the curriculum.
How we did it at Leeds, I mean, and it wasn't successful in the sense that we did it in certain ways. If you look at the number of people now supposedly involved in disability studies at Leeds, they come across a whole range of departments. And theoretically, that means that they are integrating disability issues into, but I'm not there anymore, so I can't say. For me, it doesn't, one of the things that did actually come across was medicine. Ironically, one of the things that doctors at Leeds were talking about was the causes of impairment, basically. And we were trying to show, we did successfully at one point, show how social issues create medical problems and exacerbate medical problems. Now, from a medical point of view, from a doctor's point of view, that's something very important because they can't do anything about that, if you see what I mean. So it did have an impact, and we did have disability studies engaged into medicine at one department. And as I've already said, we did get it into engineering, because if you think about legislation, we have legislation in the UK which is about making buildings accessible. So consequently, you know, disabled people can show how buildings are accessible, if you see what I mean. I mean, Manchester Coalition were one of the first organisations that actually produced guidelines for new buildings because of the way in which, you know, they interacted with buildings. I mean, one of the things that was so ridiculous at Leeds, they produced stainless steel writing, stainless steel boards with black writing on it. Of course, now that's not contrasting enough for someone with visual impairments, and of course it had to be changed because of that issue. Do you see what I mean? So that's the only way you can do it, and it's by getting involved with the people who are designing these issues and showing the advantages of bringing disability issues into the curriculum, if you see what I mean. It's not easy, because one of the sad things about university is people will get into a mindset of what their discipline is, and it's changing all the time. Is whatever discipline you're in, it's constantly changing, and to bring things in that don't conform to what supposedly is changing, and everybody thinks that just because something's changing, it must be better. It's not necessarily the case. If buildings are being constructed just using buildings that are inaccessible to people, then they're inaccessible not just to blind people, deaf people, physical people, but anybody, because as you get older, you become impaired. Do you see what I'm getting at? So it's simply persuasion, and it's hard work. But I can't help you any further than just saying it's worth going at it, if you see what I mean. Politicians, a lot of politicians are, in my experience, are sympathetic to the arguments. The problem is funding, cost, buildings, changing things from things that are on tap. When you build a building, you've got doors of particular sizes. Do you see what I mean? To change it means money, and money's not always available these days.
Thanks, Colin. Leah here. So we've got about 4 minutes left for panelists. So if we can hear from Susan, Alexis and Simon. And can I just ask everyone to say their names as well, just before you ask the question, so we all know who it is. Thank you.
This is Alexis, if I could take a moment now and do a really annoying thing and ask a two-pronged question, but I think it's fairly concise. As I appreciate Karen's question about how to support emerging scholars, because I think that would be the category in which I fall into as somebody with a PhD in critical disability studies here in Canada, and now a postdoctoral fellow, and thinking about the future of disability studies, but also working very closely with the disability rights movement locally, nationally, and internationally. And so one thing I'm wondering is in reflection of your story, and thank you so much for sharing your vulnerability and your candid story with us. But wondering first, where you find the strongest encouragement for your hopes that the good things you've been working on would come to fruition. So what is an example of like good things that are now actually coming to fruition that confirm your hopes for what's possible? And then, and similarly, going forward, how can disability studies scholars better support and work with organizations of persons with disabilities, given what you talked about in terms of the challenges with funding and resources and so on, and the exclusive, ableist, and accessible systems we're working within?
Well, the only way that we were involved was because we were disabled people, and we went to organisations. But Mark wasn't a disabled person, isn't a disabled person, neither is Emma Stone, who now is chair of the Roundtree Foundation. It's a commitment to go and work with organisations of disabled people, talk to them, be part of their organisations if it's simply just observation. It's difficult at first because a lot of organisations and disabled people are susceptible to arguments against research and academia. You know, what's it going to do for me? Oh, they're not talking about stuff that I don't understand, you know, using big words, all that kind of stuff. The only way that you can draw in organizations is by going and making yourself part of those organizations in one way or another, if you see what I mean. If you do research, for example, you know, you can ask organizations to be part of your research group, monitoring systems and so on and so forth. Find out what's available at the local level. Involve yourself in those organizations in one way or another, if you see what I mean. The other thing, of course, is that academic barriers are sometimes really difficult. I mean, we at Leeds, we started by not asking students to have certain qualifications. You know, when we started the disability diploma and MA program, students could apply to the course if they had relative experience of impairment and were willing to prove that they could do the course. We used to ask them to write an essay on what they understand as disability and why they want to do disability studies, a 3,000-word essay, nothing more than that, basically. That's how some students got on the course, and successful ones too, and ended up completely. I mean, I can remember one, Rachel Patel. She often tells people how when she came for the interview and asked to do an essay, it made her go home and cry. But she did the essay and did a MA, and now works in a health authority down in Bristol. So, you know, it's adjusting. You see, there is, if you go into engineering, if somebody's been working in particular areas in engineering in universities without actually doing any academic work, they can join courses simply because of the practical experience. And that's how we got round it at Leeds, by bringing in students who don't necessarily have the prerequisite 3 A levels or whatever to get on courses in disability studies. But once they get on the courses, if the courses are well structured and accessible, then they fly through. You always get failures, but you'll get failures in whether they're able-bodied or disabled or not. The encouraging thing about disability studies for me, and it depends on how you bring in your students. This is a discipline that's relatively new, and yet has a history which nobody knows about. It should be accessible to everybody who's involved in disability studies without mysticism and language which is not clear and accessible, if you see what I mean. It's for me, it's a people's discipline. It's not necessarily an academic discipline, but there's plenty of academic work around. But the question that I always ask somebody who's written something like this, do you think a disabled person would understand what you're talking about? And if they can't answer that, then they're not really doing disability studies for me, if you know what I mean. I'm not sure whether I'm answering these questions as you want me to answer them, but I'm only trying to be as honest as I can.
This is Alexis. Yes, thank you. That was great.
I'm not sure that it's as helpful as you want it to be, but I can't tell you anything else. I can only work on my own experience, and that's how we've got over lots of barriers. When we're in universities and universities are talking about academic disciplines and so on and so forth, and I just say, well, let's have a look at a reading list. How long is that reading list? Have you read any of those? No, why not? That's an academic discipline. They're all theories. There's plenty of theories about disability studies that are written by disabled people as well as by professional academics. Finkelstein was no academic, not in the UK anyway, if you know what I mean.
And then we've got loads of questions from our audience. So Susan and Simon, do you have any quick comments?
I have a quick one. Yeah, the first one is a simple one. Can you turn your light on, Colin, because you're becoming a shrinking violet there, and all I can see is your glasses.
Oh, well, sorry.
Nobody else, I tell you. I'm just going to make a comment, because if I asked you what I wanted to ask you, you go on forever. The comment is one of the ways that Theresa asked about how you get people involved in disability studies, how universities, how different disciplines get involved. It's simple. If you remember, Colin, there was a social policy module which did the historical thing about welfare. It started off historically and then ended up in a thematic approach whereby people of world-class ability like Colin were asked to do a lecture. So right from level 1, students were introduced to disability studies. And that's the way you can spread the word about it. You can, get people involved straight away, because you can't just expect students to come to a university and pick and choose their own subjects. I mean, how do they know what it's all about?
Well, I did say when I was talking earlier, and I'd forgotten about it, that I started teaching sociology and social policy at Leeds and bringing disability in to the courses, as you do when you bring equality on race and all that sort of stuff. And when you're talking about capitalism, you talk about the way in which that, so many people were institutionalized in the 19th century because they couldn't participate in the workplace. What's that? Oh, it's disability studies. You see what I mean? You build it in.
I wasn't criticizing you. I was saying what you did.
Well, as I said, I can't remember everything.
I know that. I was just helping. Anyways, we'll throw it open to the audience. I've given up on helping the other old man in this panel.
Did you have a quick comment?
Yes, very, very, very quick question. You were talking about researching young disabled people in your history of your work. In the light of your work, what would you raise now? What kind of issues would you research now with young disabled people? What would be the most interesting issues to raise in the study?
Well, it depends, because I mean, one of the things that's really problematic when you're young is peer group pressure. Oh, where have you gone?
I'm here. I'm here.
Peer group pressure. That's the hardest thing it was for me. basically are wearing thick glasses in the 1960s, you know, was not cool at all. And that is the hardest thing when you're young, particularly because as you get older, there's no question about it, most people become more accessible because they may have acquired impairment, they've got some kind of illness or whatever. But when you, in your period between say 10 or 11 and 18, 20, that's when exclusion from dances and all that kind of stuff's really heavy. And that's what I don't think that's changed a lot, to be honest. I mean, the best thing in terms of changing that, I suppose, really has been the growth of impairment-related sports, you know, like wheelchair football and stuff like that. That's changed, but it's still segregated, if you know.
Yes, yes, that's definitely the problem. Yeah, I agree.
But that for me has always been, I mean, the only reason when I got involved with the contact group, that's the group I worked with in the 1980s, that the situation for those kids was exclusion, not just from the families, you know, the families were there, but they couldn't, whereas normal kids would be introduced to industry, you know, the careers, people would go around schools and they would introduce people to say local engineering firms and so on and so forth, and printing firms and tailoring firms. So this is where you can get work and so on and so forth. What happened to the disabled kids that were all involved in the contact group? The social workers used to go around to the schools where disabled kids were, special schools, and introduce them to day centres, knowing that there were no schools, no jobs for them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
So they ended up as groups of disabled people, which was fine for them, but outside those groups, they didn't have any friends. All the friends were in that disabled persons group, if you see what I mean. And
Yes.
it's really hard for kids. I mean, for me, what you really need to, it's okay talking to disabled people about this. What I would like, if I was doing research now, I'd want to do research on average young people and their attitude to particular kinds of conditions and impairments and stuff. And why, have they got any disabled people friends? Do they know any disabled people? Because those are the kind of issues that can draw in why people are excluded, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
You talk to disabled people, you can tell me what they go, oh, well, I can't get to the dance, you know, the girls don't like me because I'm in a wheelchair, stuff like that. You expect, but what you really want to know is, why is it that young people who are obviously caring in lots of ways don't relate to the importance of having disabled people as part of their, have they ever come across disabled people?
Yeah.
Who are the disabled people? Do they always associate it with age? Stuff like that. That's, for me, is something that interests me. But I'm too old to do that. I just think, well, silly old fool like him, what's he asking questions like that? Do you see what I mean?
Mm. Yes, and that really hasn't changed a lot, because they're still they're still excluded from many types of youth communities.
In some respects, I think it's made worse, because now cosmetic surgery, all that kind of stuff, it's not just about impairment, it's about how you look. You know, I mean, severe acne, for example, can be a disabling condition simply because you're too intimidated by looking in a mirror. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm gonna
thank you very much.
We've got a load of questions and we're definitely not going to get through all of them. So I'll try and just pick out some of the questions and any that kind of tie in together as well. So one question that we've got is from Lauren, and it's about some of the criticisms of the social model by post-colonial and Indigenous scholars and activists for centering a white Western view of disability, and how this can sometimes ignore the role of community and family and create sharp binaries between disabled and non-disabled people that don't really reflect the reality in global South settings. Have you got any brief thoughts on that, Colin?
Well, I'm not from the global south, fair enough. Okay, now if you accept the fact that all societies exclude some particular group of people on the basis of perceived inferiority, whether it be physical, mental, or whatever, then I cannot understand why the social model is such a problem. Because it's not the people who have got the condition that's the problem, it's the perceptions of the people. And focusing on that is a social model, if you like, analysis, is it not?
Okay, so it's about how we
Yes.
use and apply the social model within those.
Yeah, so look, let's set it aside, not the phrase social model. If you don't like the social model as a phrase, fine. But what do you want to focus on? If you're focusing on issues around perceptions of impairment, it's no good talking to the person with the impairment. You've got to talk to society, haven't you? You see what I mean? Because you're not going to get perceptions of impairment from individuals because they've received from other people, if you see what I mean.
Thank you. And then we've got, this is a really good question that came up quite early, and I think related to the books that you were showing at the beginning of the talk. So when we talk about, this was from Anne, when we talk about fully accessible disability studies books, very often these are not actually fully accessible for people with learning difficulties and intellectual disabilities. So what can we do as disability studies scholars to open these up and to stop disabling people with learning difficulties?
People with learning difficulties all want to know about disability studies, basically. I mean, I've worked with disabled people with learning difficulties, and everything, all the stuff that we write about can be made quite simple. You know, basically, there's nothing complicated about disability studies when you actually get around to it. If you, for example, if you want to show a disabled person with learning difficulties, say, about reading, for example, you know, and they can't read quickly, then you can talk to them and show them why it's a problem. You know, you just find the words that they need to explain what they want to know. It's time consuming, yes, but that's not a problem, surely.
Yeah, so about responsibility and accountability as scholars to make that information accessible.
I mean, what we've tried to do, if you look at all the social model stuff, all the books that I've written, we've tried to be as clear as possible with a general, within the general vocabulary. We try to avoid complicated concepts and abstract rationale. When we did the disability discrimination project, for example, we produced various sort of leaflets summarizing arguments, complex arguments, like, for example, disabled people are 3 times more likely to be unemployed in Britain than non-disabled people, full stop. Not lots of figures and stuff like that. Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And anybody can understand that. And if they can't, then you just say, look, here's the bag of sweets. That's how many people, rich people, can get. That's how many you can get. Do you see what I mean? There's loads of ways you can do it if you really think about it. It's getting beyond the academic mindset, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and beyond often some of those constraints that we have put on us as well.
Again,
absolutely.
It's working with all kinds of people, older people, you know, they don't want to know about social model language or the social model, but they certainly want to know why they can't use the local buses. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you. We've had a couple of questions about COVID. So Kathy has asked about thoughts on invisible disabilities and how that's increasing due to long COVID. So how can disability studies and medical sociology theorise those issues? And then we've also had a question from Jonathan about COVID, about how, you know, during COVID, a lot of events and a lot of services became temporarily more accessible. And so shouldn't we be making the case that, you know, things like academic events, as an example, should be hybrid, should be made more accessible, as we have done throughout the pandemic?
Well, at Leeds, when we did anything, we always, if you look at the books that I mentioned, they're all half academics and half disabled activists, or disabled people, if you like. When we did research projects, whatever research projects I was involved in, always had an advisory group which included disabled people. And one of the advantages of that is that you cannot go beyond being accessible to people who you hope. You know, it's no good academics writing disability studies books that are just going to be academic. Because one of the things that I said right from the very beginning, disability studies should be about theory, policy and practice. All science really should be about that, apart from philosophy. And even philosophy's got implications for practice. But disability studies should be theory, policy and practice. And all our courses at Leeds were.
Thank you. We've had some questions about, so from Lucia and from Rados, about the intersection.
I missed something. There's lots of impairments that are invisible. Mental health is invisible, but it's still an impairment. My mother, she had a mental health issue, and you wouldn't notice for when she was well, but she was very conscious of always having a mental health problem and very worried about whether it would reappear. Now, that is an issue, an impairment issue, but the understanding of that and not being able to understand why she's like that is a disability issue. You see what I mean? And it's same with long COVID. If you've had long COVID, you're likely to lose your hearing, maybe not smell properly, not taste properly, all that, which is an impairment. So it's something that is not visible, but it's there, if you see what I mean, and should be treated as an impairment and treated with respect and understanding.
Yeah. And then in terms of thinking about, I guess, opening up the social model again and thinking about impairment more broadly, we've had a couple of questions about impairments and disablement that's produced by violence. So produced by violence or through poverty, medical negligence, lack of access to decent healthcare. How can the social model apply to that context?
Well, the lack of access to medical care is a social model issue, isn't it? Full stop. Yeah. I mean, as I said when I was starting, you know, when I was talking about sort of poverty and so on and so forth, that in itself is a disability issue. If people can't eat properly, they become impaired one way or the other, if you see what I mean. If people can't afford medical treatment, or medical treatment's not accessible because they haven't got any money, that's a medical issue, that's a social model issue, if you see what I mean. I mean, we're very lucky, or we were very lucky in the UK because we had a welfare state. Those periods of time, people believed that services should be provided, essential services should be free. All that's changed. That's a social model issue. You know, a social model can't solve the fact that doctors will work only for money. That's a political issue. And this is one of the reasons why you have to understand disability studies is political. In fact, all social science is political. It's not abstract, or it shouldn't be. The whole point of sociology is to understand society and how to improve it, as I understood it, and I studied sociology. It's not just...
So do you think that so in terms of addressing impairment and disablement that's produced by violence, for example, do you think that the social model of disability is well placed to be able to do that?
Of course, because, you know, the causes of impairment is essentially can be social. I mean, how else can you understand somebody who's got an impairment? Okay, so you don't just restrict it to their condition. It's about the way they got the condition. and how you respond to that condition after you've got it, if you see what I mean. I mean, I'm not sure how the question, do you not explain violence in terms of social issues?
So it was just a question, and sorry if it feels like I'm jumping around, I'm just trying to get as many questions in as I can. It was just a question about the tensions, limits and possibilities of the social model to address impairments and disablement that are produced by violence. So the example given was in armed conflict or through the use of non-lethal weapons in protest.
Well, in an ideal world, there wouldn't be any violence, if you see what I mean. The unfortunate thing about society is it's disabling in a variety of ways, and one of them is that we are violent people. You know, we've engaged in wars. One of the important things that we have to understand when we look at disability issues and the history of disablement is that after war, each war, certainly in recent times, all wars have led to certain policies to address problems faced by disabled veterans. Not successfully, but if you think about the welfare state that was introduced in 1945 in many countries, that was a result of the atrocities that were committed in the Second World War. Some were introduced after the First World War.
And so that links to one of the questions that we've had actually about disability rights and in terms of policy. So a question from Ali, do you think the mashing together of all of the equalities legislation weakened disability rights in the UK?
Yeah. Yes, definitely. If you think about issues about gender, race, and so on and so forth, anything, if you want, whatever you want to talk about it, it doesn't involve physically changing society. It doesn't really involve lots of financial involvement or commitment. To address disablement in terms of structure, architecture, time, finance, costs money. And governments these days are not prepared to pay for it. Instead, they'd rather create poverty, impairment in old age, medical problems that can't be solved. If you think about wealthy people that have got access to funding. For example, Norman Tebbett's wife was damaged in a bomb attack on Mrs. Thatcher's government in the 1980s. He never bothered about disability issues because his wife, who was physically disabled, had 3 nurses provided by the state because he was a member of parliament. So she didn't have to worry about getting on buses and all that sort of stuff. If that had been a poor person, where would they get the 3 nurses from? Do you see the difference?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've had a few questions actually that have touched upon poverty and class and how that intersects with disability. We've had a few questions more specifically focused around education. So what do you think is the relevance of inclusion in the current context of education? And also, do you think there's any potential to promote disability studies more in secondary schools?
Yeah. I think, again, going back to my central point, I think it's fundamental. Because going back to the question earlier about young people and friendships and peer group pressure, if you're going to address disablement for young people and the issues around peer group pressure, then all young people need to know what disability is and the consequences of exclusion for their peers and for themselves. For example, if they get damaged in football, damaged in rugby, all those kind of things. The point that I'm trying to get that comes across in all of this is disability studies, if you want to use those terms, is fundamental. We used to call it disability awareness. You know, teaching people about disability. The disabled people's movement in Britain developed a disability awareness training, which was about disabled people. And that's how my first job at Leeds, getting people from industry, from other colleges, coming to Leeds for 3 days, introducing them to the social modeler, saying, how do you address these issues within your context at work? Come up with some policy that will address part of the problems faced by disabled people in your college, in your school. And you've only got to get them to think of one thing, and then they can think of other things, because it's not computer science. It's obvious. If you, for example, if you're putting signs on a board, you don't use a silver background with grey writing on it, do you? You make it so it's contrasting, black, white writing, white background, black writing. You see what I mean? Obvious. But it might not be stylishly acceptable for those with certain aesthetic interests rather than practical interests.
And I think that, yeah, and that ties into one of the questions again, so about engaging other departments in disability studies, and how often that can be quite challenging. So is that a manifestation of social oppression of disabled people more broadly?
I think going back to Alice and I used to talk about how we could include the whole university and all schools to include disability issues in everything that they do, you know, like history, like, you know, many people in history have been disabled in one way or another, had impairments and so on. And people don't often notice all that. Do you know what I mean? So you've got to build it into everyday life. Disability awareness training can be applied to any discipline, any context, anywhere. I could go around this house and say, how can I make it more accessible to a physically impaired person? You see what I mean? I'm probably not as good as a physically impaired person, but they could show me much things that I wouldn't see. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It should be central to education, central to schools, particularly.
Yeah. And I think often, I know I've been at events before, and when you're working within disability studies, those questions about accessibility, those kind of that general understanding is there, but you feel like you're constantly kind of hitting your head against a brick wall when engaging with people outside of that discipline. And I know that that's
constant. I mean, going back to the Disability Archive, if anybody's interested, if gone to the Disability Archive at Leeds and look up disability equality training produced by, I can't remember, it's London something 1990. Little booklet telling you how to do simple disability equality training introductions, like I've just described.
And then something, I guess, which some really nice questions we've had from Inga and Rebecca. So Rebecca's asked, what are some of the really pressing issues within our field right now? What can we proactively be doing as researchers, particularly in a context of rising cost of living and poverty? And then also some general advice to disabled students and researchers that are facing barriers, discrimination and ignorance. So a bit of advice on where disability studies is going, and also some more advice for disabled students and researchers themselves.
Disabled students and disabled researchers should not ever accept being denied access to the resources they need because of impairment. Do you follow what I mean? Large print, for example, computer systems that are accessible. They shouldn't accept second quality gear, because if they're competing with non-disabled students who don't have to address those barriers, then that puts them at a disadvantage. Now that's difficult, but it's something that you have to accept and address, okay? The issues that, there's so many issues about, one of the things that you could spring into mind just out of the top of my head, how poverty impacts on people's diet and the implications of that diet on set of some sort of disabling condition. Those kind of things, you know, like poverty, particularly with older people. You know, people get older and they might not be able to get upstairs and so on. How difficult is it for them to get their house made accessible? Things like that. Do you see what I mean? Because the longer you're, and how long, for example, if you break your hip and you have to wait 6 months or 9 months or whatever to get it fixed because you don't have enough money to pay for it straight away, then you want to do research on how much that time lapse, because they don't have access to decent medicine, causes a further impairment. So at the end of it, they might not be able to walk at all. Do you see what I mean? There's loads of things you can think of, absolutely loads.
And in terms of, again, where disability studies is at right now, we've had a question from Luke about there's some emphasis in some disability studies on discourse analysis and identity formation at the expense of analysis of economic exclusion, political structures in relation to disabled people. This is something that you've criticised before. Do you have any more recent thoughts on it now?
No, not at all. Not in the least. As I say, if you're interested in why people accept, in inverted commas, a disabled identity, I think that has an important issue to raise, because if you disable somebody intellectually, then you're causing further problems for society in the end anyway. So I think it's important to know that, but it's got to have obvious, for me, all research has got to have obvious physical, practical implications. You know, researchers can go on and on and on, and you know, the problem with a lot of research is it ends up by saying, yeah, but we need more research. You know, and I think that's a problem, because it's good for researchers who can just go back and get more money, but it's not good for the people who are researching, if you see what I mean. Does that make sense? Yeah,
so it's about the purpose and the outcomes of that research as well.
How will, if somebody wants to do research into identity formation, okay, then I'd want to know what practical outcome that has for the people that they're researching. And if you can't answer that, then I'm not sure the research is worth doing. Does that sound fierce and wrong? You know, I mean, the interesting thing is that when I first came across Paul Hunt's book about the experience of disability, disablement, stigma, 1966, it was located in psychology, right? There was nothing in it, the book, that provided practical solutions to anything, apart from Hunt's critical condition chapter, which is not very long, but if you read that chapter, which is at the beginning of the book, which sets the whole tone for the rest of the book and all these people's experiences, 5 other men and 6 women, then you get you understand what disability studies is about, because Paul sets out in that book what the condition is, and it's not the people with the impairments, it's the issues that they have to face because of impairments. Do you see what I mean? There's another article in it by a chap called Louis Bataille, which is about the Chatterley syndrome. You know the story of Lady Chatterley? Do you know Lady Chatterley? No, you don't. Well, it's a story. Sorry?
I know her well. Yeah. Met her when she was young.
Lady Chatterley doesn't love her husband because he's in a wheelchair. So she takes another lover, which is what Bataille is doing. It's showing how that book implicates that disabled people are important, not just physically, but intellectually as manually as well, if you see what I mean. Which is important because the media is important about shaping our ideas about disability, isn't it?
Yeah.
Have you come on because it's over, Simon, or is it just sticking his nose in?
No, just start sticking my nose in. There ain't much of it, for goodness sake.
So in terms of media, that brings us on to another question, and probably one of the final ones that we'll have. In terms of representation of more disabled people, especially disabled children in film and television more recently, so over the past 5 to 7 years, and that we've got more disabled characters now being played by disabled actors. Do you think this helps more generally?
Definitely. If you go back to a report that I produced in 1993 about, it's on the archive. I can't remember what it's called. It's 1993. All this stuff's on the archive. So you go back to 1993, and there's 11 points that people need to address to make the archive or the media more acceptable to disabled people. And bringing disabled characters in is one of them. Another one is misrepresenting people as normal, because there's no such thing as normal, if you see what I mean. We're all slightly different, but to suggest people are normal is losing the fact that disabled people, all disabled people, in fact, all people are different, but disabled people feel it worse because they're not normal, if you see what I mean. Normality is an illusion. Anyway, that's a bit abstract, but you get the point. You walk down the street and everybody else is walking and you can't walk. You don't feel normal. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And then I've got one final question, because we're coming up to 5 minutes now. One last one. This is from Deborah. So knowing what you know now, what would you do differently, if anything, within the field of disability studies?
What would I do now? Knowing what I do now, I would get into a situation where I could demand that other disciplines take on issues around disability. I would be particularly interested in finding out why academic disciplines such as engineering, architecture, medicine are not taking on board issues that are raised by disabled people over access, finance, medical services, all those things. I would focus on those things because to some extent, and I don't mean this critically, but it's easy focusing on disabled people because a lot of disabled people want to talk about, disability, not necessarily their impairment, but they'll talk about exclusion if you ask them the right questions and all that sort of stuff. But the people who we need to change are the people who are teaching people how to do things in society, how to think about society, how to design things, how to make things accessible, how to include people. We need to get teachers to understand that disability should be part of every course so that people who are disabled for some way or other don't feel excluded. Do you see what I mean? Like you were saying, there's more disabled people on the media, there's more disabled people around. That's good, but not enough. And, we need more. Yeah. Full stop.
Absolutely, thank you. And I will just say we've had a lot of really nice comments as well. A lot of people not make you blush.
I can imagine. Anyway, thanks for listening.
It's all been very good, and lots of people thanking you for your time and for inspiring, interesting lecture. So thank you.
Can I just also, it's Karen here, can I just also say thanks to Michael Zander, who's given us a nice little comment, if everybody wants to have a look, about the author of Lady Chatterley as a pre-fascist of euthanasia. And so thank you for following up. That's great.
Thank you, Karen. Simon, do you have anything you want to say?
I'd like to say thanks to Simon, firstly for this, and secondly for setting up a really important institution, organisation, Injustice International. Fantastic achievement, Simon. Well done. Full stop.
There's not what I need to say. Thank you.
No,
I'll get you back.
well, thank you everyone so much for joining, and it's been so great to have such an international presence, and for all of the questions and the comments in the chat. I have saved all of the questions. So there was someone asked if we could send that out after it's taken place. So that's so I'll make sure that happens too. Some more questions for you to ponder that we've not got to as well. And thank you, Colin, again, just for the time and obviously everything that you've done for disability studies. It's been fab to listen to you speak this evening. Okay.
Thank you all. Have a good life.
We should have a follow-up.
What? We're doing something next September. If you're all interested in, maybe somebody's interested in sharing alongside Leah. No, right.
So that's all.
I'll paste to you later.
You can find that on the Injustice International website, can't you? So the next event, Simon.
Yeah, they can. I thought they'd gone.
We've lost a lot of people. I think people are going now. So I'll close the webinar. And yeah,
thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Okay.